Roll call, please. Yes?
Here.
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 Here. Right, so tonight we are going to actually turn it over to staff to present the budget, the general fund of the budget. And um, as usual, we usually just ask questions within each section. Is everyone okay with that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so I'm gonna jump around a little bit. So I did put page numbers on it for you, so we can follow along with the pages. Actually, just because Jay yells at me if I don't put page numbers on it. We'll start with just the general overview. Hopefully you guys got a chance to review this. It is a general fund tonight, so it's all the basic services. It's all administrative staff. It is police, fire, finance, human resources, legal, parks, recreation. Did I miss anything? Oh, planning, building and planning, cemetery, and roaming crew, partial. That's everything. I could have just read it off. I wrote it all down. When we're talking general fund, it is almost exclusively funded through taxes or intergovernmental transfers, while there are some fees for services that apply in, we get some of the forfeitures and fines through the court system, and we also get some of the fees with the rec department. Those are some of the expenditures, but they're not that much. What costs money in the general fund? It's mostly personnel and benefits at 68% of the general fund, which actually is low industry-wide. Usually you're talking 70% or above when you're talking personnel and benefits, because it's not a capital-heavy area. And the function, as far as the costliest function goes in the general fund, it is public safety. So that includes police, fire, ambulance. That's over 50% of our expenditures for the general fund. The guidance that you have provided to the staff, two separate pieces on the general fund. In addition to just the strategic plan in general and what our priorities are, you do give specific guidance that we are required to maintain at least a 16.67 operational reserve. So that basically means 2 months worth. And the strategic plan establishes a goal of 33 1/3, which would be 4 months. So that is the guidance you guys gave us. We also have some guidance to realize efficiencies and guidance on increasing the professionalism and transparency involved in the budget process. As far as significant changes in accounting for this year, you'll notice that almost across the board, all of the funds will see a large increase in expenditures. That is because we've started accounting for personnel costs in the funds where they're actually realized. So before we had separate funds for health insurance, we had separate funds for pensions, and so those didn't show up in the general fund. Now they do. So you'll see when you see a 33% increase or a 50% increase in costs, that's because those costs weren't accounted for in the general fund before. It should make it easier for people to understand. It shows the entire cost instead of spreading it out across different funds. Another result of that is it drives up the operational reserve. So when we're talking operational reserve, we're really talking what would it take to continue to operate for that number of months. So it doesn't include capital purchases. What else is not included in operating expenses? Debt service, anything like that wouldn't be included. So that really is what does it take to run. And we can talk about that when we actually get to where our operating reserve is. As far as major changes to the budget this year, the most significant is that we added a planning director position that starts 1 January. That will be advertised probably shortly after we get the approval through the whole budget process. What that's going to allow us to do is, this is part of the strategic plan where we talked about succession planning. As Jim approaches the end of his career with the city, we want to be able to use his expertise, one, to plan to train his replacement, but also to move him into a position where he can work on the code full time, and we can actually perhaps rewrite it from beginning to end. So this is the first step of that. So while that is a new cost in this budget, it's going to be an even larger cost in next year's budget, because we'll go from basically half a year to a full year at that point. And there'll be a few years where we're paying both of those positions while we rewrite the code and get the planning director up to speed. The other large change in this year's budget was the workman comps rate for firefighters. There was a law passed at the state level that basically said there is a series of illnesses that they will presumptively consider to be caused by being a firefighter, and they will be covered under workman's comp. There's a lot of details on how exactly that works, but what it did is it increased our workman's comp rate for firefighters 65% for this coming year. So that is the actual increase from MMIA. That's a solid number. It equates to about $45,000 in the fire and ambulance budget split between the two, right? Is that right? 43 just for fire. So it's 43 in each.
What's the breakdown to per hour? Did they ever tell you, like, when I was in construction, it's, like.
Yeah, I don't know if we break
per-
it down.
Yeah.
We don't break it down that far.
Yeah, it's not, yeah, it's a lot. Yeah, I mean, yeah, per 100, yeah.
So that's kind of the overview. As far as some of the budget decisions that have already been made before it came to you is the second page. If you look at it, if it's in parentheses, that means we cut it or we move that cost to somewhere else. If it's not in parentheses, that means that was an additional cost after we started the budget process that got added in. You can see the workman's comp there. That's just from the overall rate. Other rates, we moved some of the admin costs from Public Works back into the enterprise funds and out of the general fund, so that saved some. This year, we're using a lot of our impact fees. So those are not going to be available in future years, but you can see for the police department, we're using about 30,000, for the fire department, about 8,000. We originally had budgeted for the planner position for the full year and realized we couldn't make the balanced budget that way. So we cut that back to half a year. Vault toilets for Cabanel Park, Sackett Park feasibility study. We also moved a bunch of the park costs into the park impact fees. So about $20,000 there moved out of the general fund and onto the impact fees. We cut back on legal and professional services, some of the computer replacements. We adjusted our budgeting for building permits down by $10,000. We got some of the historic preservation grant. We realized we didn't budget for the elections in the first one, so we had to add that back in to $7,500 to run the election this fall. We cut out wall padding for the Civic Center, vehicle for the roaming crew. We did increase the pool chemicals by about 3,000, cut another 1,000 out of computer supplies, another 1,000 out of fuel, 1,750 out of overtime, and then we cut a seasonal position for the roaming crew, which was another $15,000. So in total, we made about $130,000 worth of cuts to get to where we are. So if you go to page 3, and you might want to use page 3, you might want to use page 4. Those are our estimated mill levies for this year. So this is the actual taxes that are increasing. Page 3 gives it to you in the form of mills. Page 4 gives it to you in the form of dollars. It just depends on how you'd like to look at it. Some of the changes we made this year, if you look at it versus 2019, we were able to move some of our mills back into the general fund. So we had 166.8 last year. It's 173 this year. Some of that is due to the value of the mills. Permissive health insurance went up by not quite 2 mills. And the voted mill levies, a couple of them, let's see, none of them actually drop off this year. The 2000 fire truck drops off next year. So that'll be the last year for the 2000 fire truck voted mill levy. That 1.65 mills will go away. And you can see the railroad crossing has almost fallen off, but there is still part of the general fund that we are budgeting to cover the last year, which wasn't covered by the mill levy. So you'll see a transfer for that. That is pretty much it with the mills. You can see our total mills are slightly lower than last year. That's because the state adjusts it to make sure that we don't grow any faster than that half rate of inflation over the past 3 years. So if our mills become too valuable, they actually reduce the number of mills that we can levy. Right. So in this case, I think they actually went up this year for the general fund, right? You went up by 3-ish.
Our general levy.
Yeah. Or overall.
Our mills went down because we needed less to cover the 2000 fire truck.
Right. Yeah, you can see the 2000 fire truck went from 3 to 1.65, so that's where that reduction came in.
And that's the 2000.
Oh, that's right, because it was the first year to the second year. So that went down actually 4 mills, which was a pretty big decrease. Dollar-wise, you can see that equates to about 2.9 million total coming in. Not all of that will go into the general fund. That's about 2.4 million. So that's where our levies are projected to come in this year. We won't get final numbers until, when do we get final numbers? September. There is a new product this year, which I really like a lot on page 5. It gives you the general fund summary, and it breaks it down, and I think in some really useful ways to be able to tell how we're spending our money. So at the top, it shows you your revenues. You can see the two big sources of revenue there are taxes and assessments at 2.4 million, but also intergovernmental revenue at 1.8 million. A lot of that is the entitlement share that comes from the state. Some of it is operating expenses from the county for, well, that goes in dispatch, does it? Yep. So anything else in there besides entitlement share?
The big one in the intergovernmental revenues is the state share credit that we were required to record for a state contribution to pensions for general fund employees.
So that's one of those we credit as a revenue and an expenditure, but never actually see.
No cash exchange.
Yeah.
It's just bookkeeping on the state level. You can see fines and forfeitures are still a sizable amount, charges for service, but they're only in the $100,000 range out of the total $6 million. So 6.1 million is the total revenue we look at. The expenditures, you can see those broken down into two different ways. The first one is by category. So again, we talked about personnel and benefits. You can see that's a little over 4 million, a little over 4.1 million. Operations are at 1.1 million. Capital at 300,000, debt service at 15,000, and then other finance uses at 436. What's a couple of things that are in that? Tina, tell off the top of your
Other
head.
financing uses,
Yeah.
are the transfer to dispatch.
Transfer to dispatch. Transfer to dispatch is probably the vast majority of it, right?
It is,
Yeah.
yeah. 375 dispatch and then
So that's where that falls in. I also like the next expenditure by function category that tells you for the functions that you get out of the general fund, what we're spending. So you can see general government, which covers most things, is about 1.4 million. Public safety is over 3 million. Public works is down there. That would be the roaming crew and some of the park stuff. Do we put cemetery in there? Yeah. So that's at 400,000. Rec, you can see, is at 500,000. Public health's down at 145. Debt service again down at 10,000, and then other financing uses at 383 again, and that should be mostly dispatch again. So if you look at beginning fund balance, you can see again. So the first column is FY18. The second column is the actual budgeted for this year. The next column is what was budgeted in 19, and the final column is what we are currently projecting to be at the end of FY19. Yeah, that's nice. So what you can notice, the beginning fund balance is quite a bit larger than what we're projecting for the ended fund balance. So most of that is when we closed out these accounts that were retirement account, the pension accounts and the health accounts, they had balances in them as well. So those balances are going to get transferred into the general fund. So they offset some of those additional costs. But that's why the beginning fund balance is going to go up as much as it does. Revenue, also you see a big jump in that, and that's because those revenue sources that were coming in for pension or health insurance and going into those other funds will now be coming into the general fund. So you can see it's accounted. And then expenditures the same way. Those expenditures that were in other funds will now be accounted for. So basically everything went up because we started to account for those costs in the general fund instead of where they were. But it does, in the ending fund balance, give you about $1.1 million as an ending fund balance for the year, which is, it's actually pretty good. And with that, I'm going to skip you all the way down to the last page, which is page 26, before we start to get into individual funds. You can look under the totals page there, and it gives you a couple of the numbers we're talking about. So again, in the second column is the budgeted year. You can see our operating expenditures went up from a budget of in FY19 of almost 3.8 million to 4.8 million. And that's all those additional costs that we added in for personnel. What that does is it drives a much larger reserve requirement than we had before, which is good. You can see that for the 16.67, which was mandated by the commission, we would have to have a little over $800,000 as an ending fund balance. And if you go down to our projected for FY20 ending fund balance, it's 1.1 million, which puts us at a 22.8% reserve. Which actually, even though we're adding all these costs in, is a little higher than it was in projected to be in FY19. So we are still gaining a little bit. You can see that in the fact that our revenue is about 6.11 million and our expenditures are about 6.03 million. So roughly $82,000 that we are going to add to the reserve this year based off of revenue versus expenditures. So that's kind of the large overview. Any questions on that before we start hitting individual funds or summaries?
Any questions?
All right, 6 and 7 just gives you a more detailed breakdown of our revenue. A couple of things I do want to point out on this page is if you look down, the ones that have notes are kind of what we thought were notable. So building licenses, you can see that's based on 35 to 37 new housing starts. That's our estimate. That's highly volatile depending on what actually happens, but that's where we estimated it. We think it's probably fairly conservative. Also under grant money, you can see that we're looking at bringing in $156,000 in self-contained breathing apparatus grant. So that's for the fire department. That's to replace their tanks en masse to be able to fight fires with the breathing apparatus. So that's a one-time thing that'll just be in this year's budget. But that does add $156,000 to the revenue. Also down in the bottom, you can see we have two other grant monies that are coming in this case. The money for the growth policy. And while we did budget that at $60,000, that's going to be slightly less. It's going to be about $2,500 left. So it's going to be $57,500 instead of the $60,000. So we'll have to make some of that up out of our reserve. And then the Early Childhood Coalition for the coordinator position is also bringing in $80,000 worth of grants. So those are outside sources of money. The growth policy is obviously one time. The fire grant is obviously one time. The early childhood coordination is going on for multi-years. We're using multiple sources. Not all of them are guaranteed. Are any of them guaranteed? No, none of them are guaranteed. But we have been getting, we've done fairly well on that, and everyone has been fairly supportive of it. So that's a pretty good program, and you can see it's being funded fairly well outside of our tax base. And on page 7, we did a little bit of finagling with the administrative cost allocation, which is what the other funds pay the general fund for services. So water, sewer, streets, ambulance, dispatch, any fund that's not the general fund pays a certain portion back to the general fund for legal services, financial services, city manager services, to help fund some of those costs that they get services for but don't pay directly. So that's what that allocation there. So that's pretty much it for revenue. The rest of it's expenditures, which is always the exciting part. Page 8 is your budget as city commission. You can see some of those increases in there for costs like PERS that weren't in there before. Other than that, your budget hasn't changed significantly. I think we did up or actually reduced a couple places. There will be, the other thing you'll see throughout as we go through expenditures, because we've changed the way we allocate costs for computer services, IT and computers, it's getting shifted out of some of the individual funds and shifted into more of a central stores location where we're doing it more of a centralized purchasing model. But none of those are huge amounts of money. So you're going from a budget of 41,277 down to a budget of 40,852. Most of that's in your computer maintenance, which you can see drop by $1,700. Oh, I did swap those two columns.
It went up.
I went up to 41. So those are, yeah. Well, actually, it's actually going down from the projected for this year, but it did go up from the budgeted. So that's it for the commission. For the judge, you can see, again, there's going to be significant salary and wages changes in there, so it kind of makes it hard to pull out some of the other changes. She does have $5,000 in capital for some mini remodels to her office spaces. But but most of that increase can be attributed to personnel costs. A lot of it health insurance. Page 10 is administration. So this is the city manager's office budget. You'll see a significant increase in personnel costs here because where we were accounting for Faith in finance prior to this fiscal year, she's being shifted over into my accounting instead. Also, on the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see our outside entity support. We labeled those in each fund or each category if there's any outside entity support. Under city manager, we put the economic development agent for 30,000, Wind Rider for 5,000, and the spay and neuter clinic for 5,000. So that's a total of $40,000 in outside entity support. If you guys have questions on any of these, please don't save them to the end.
So far, so good.
All right. Page 11 is finance. I don't think there's any significant changes in finance except the loss of salaries and wages for Faith. So that went down. So you'll see that increase in the accounting portion of 22% is mostly attributed to that. There's nothing else really that stands out in that particular column. Elections on page 12. We did budget for that. Since it will most likely be a ballot, a polling election, they're significantly more expensive than the mail-out elections that we've been doing. We also have the mill levy in June, right? Or no, that one falls before. Never mind. That one's this year.
Municipal election.
Municipal elections in November. That's
gonna be mail.
no, I think that'll probably be polling.
That's why it's more expensive here.
Yes. But we'll see.
We didn't pull the last one, did we?
We didn't. I think it depends if they sync it up with primary stuff.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay, that makes sense, yeah.
It'll
It'd be, yeah, you got the other stuff.
Right. Under the planner, you can see there, obviously, there's two things in there that drive costs up this year. One is the addition of the planning director at the beginning of the year. The other is the cost of the growth policy itself, which is budgeted in there at $75,000. So any costs overrun in the growth policy, when we bid it out, it's more than $75,000, that will also have to come out of reserves.
So that includes more than just the growth policy itself, or you're just budgeting more than what you think it's going to cost?
The 75?
Yeah.
The 75 is solely for the growth policy,
Okay.
and it may not be enough. And we did get, so that's offset by the 57.5, which we had in revenues from outside sources, but we'll have to make up so we originally was
that.
going to be 15,000 for the city. It's now 17.5, and then any additional costs will be borne by the
Thank
city.
you for that.
Page 14 is city attorney. The only, I think, significant increase in this budget is for contract legal services. We found that we have had to use contract attorneys, not only just for if Jay's conflicted, but also because the number of cases, since we have a functioning court, is pretty high. With the volume has required some outside help to help with the prosecutions, which has been fairly effective, and we actually got a very good contract. We actually contracted out with Bruce from the former. So
Familiar with city business.
yeah, and luckily he has some background in it, so it's gone pretty smoothly so far.
Can I make a quick statement? So
Sure.
if any public has a question, please feel free to ask, because I don't want you to have to wait to the end either if it's based on something.
Page 15 is administrative services. And you can see they're broken down into different sections. So the actual HR section's up top. Then it's the Civic Center admin. You can see down in the right-hand corner of that section, we have budgeted $3,500 for a new furnace. and also $4,000 for the floor refinish. If you remember from last year, the floor refinish is one of the things that we skipped last year to save some money. So we're on year 2. It definitely needs it this year. So that's been budgeted in. Yeah. And then you can remember we actually did cut some other additional things for the Civic Center were some of the things that didn't make our list from page 2. Pool and Splash Park, you can see the cost there. I think this year we're looking at an overall loss of about 57,000. Does that sound right, Lisa? 57? It's close to 60. It's always somewhere around 60. That's assuming a normal year with normal revenues through if it's super cold or there's a problem, it'll be more than that. But for right now, it'll cost about 57,000 more than we'll bring in swimming lessons and admission fees. Administrative services admin. There is an extra cost in this year. If you look down there about most of the way down on the right-hand side, there's going to be significant, or at least some cost associated with the feasibility study that's coming out. Not only the cost of the study, but to manage that as we go forward. And as well as since the Civic Center, which has never been on the city network, is actually getting added this year because we're transitioning to Blackfoot. So we'll be able to do it with an antenna instead of fiber. There will be some costs in setting that up initially and getting the right computer equipment in there to make it compatible to talk back to the city. I think that's it on that one. 16 is the facilities admin. So this is just kind of a catch-all for several of the buildings that we have. You can see the large costs over there that we're splitting with the county. Resurfacing the parking lot for $3,700, flooring in the LE section for almost $3,000, HVAC for LE and fire of $18,500, and then some airport improvements at $6,000. So that is about $32,000 total in facilities maintenance. The rest of it's just standard janitor contracts, building repairs, maintenance costs, land leases and rents. And then the debt service on that one, I think is, I don't know what that one's for. Do you know off the top of your head?
It is the intercapital for dispatch and a small airport loan.
Right. Neither one of those are very significant. Central communications, again, this is one of those that we have used a little differently this year, but it is utilities for phones, website, internet service, and cellular phone. One of the things that the new network will allow us to do is we'll be able to go to IP phones in all of the outlying offices, which we haven't been able to do in the past. It'll get everybody on the same network server as well. So that we'll actually be able to eliminate several of our landlines that we currently have everywhere except dispatch, which requires them for part of the reasons. But that was a savings that we realized this year, which will be nice. The website as well. Hopefully you've liked the changes to the website. And cell phones, we should be able to go down with some of the cell phones because we were using those in some locations, such as the Civic Center, that didn't have landlines or internet. So now that we go to IP phones there, they'll be able to get rid of a few of the cell phones. So those costs will go down slightly.
I think we renegotiated that contract as well, but it saved a ton of money. We cut it almost in half. So
Wow.
Paige spent about 8 months on that. That was the most painful renegotiation I've ever seen in my life.
Who was it?
Verizon.
it was Verizon, but people kept.
Did we
putting
have
it
much of a
together.
choice for Verizon or AT&T and miss that?
And we really don't if we want any service outside the city.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't have a choice.
Yeah, and it would have been helpful if we could have stuck with one rep. I think we went through 4. Yeah, we went through 4 different reps during that process, and I think you started over every time. On page 18 is central stores. This is most of our office supplies, computer supplies, fuel, printing, postage, those kind of services. Down at the bottom, you can see that for computer hardware, we've broken that down into some of the Blackfoot upgrade equipment, which is about $8,000. We are replacing our Exchange server this year, which is about just under $10,000. That's just a lifetime replacement to keep it up to date. It's reaching end of life, and I can't think of anything worse than to lose all email in the city for any extended period of time.
Nothing worse.
I'm not sure there's much worse. Computer replacements also, we've been on a pretty aggressive computer replacement schedule. There are quite a few old computers that we've been limping along. We've kind of gone to a philosophy of it is cheaper and easier to replace computers than to try and upgrade them and repair them in the long run. You just spend less time and there's a lot less downtime for staff because it would take 3 to 4 days to rebuild a computer every time it crashed, and then we're trying to use spares, and in the end you're better off just replacing what you need so that you can continue to actually produce. Page 19, I like that one. That's sanitarian. That one's pretty straightforward. $35,000 for your city county sanitarian. If you go to page 20, we get into law enforcement. We actually cut a vehicle out of last year's budget and possibly the budget year before that and possibly the budget year before that. So we're budgeting for 2 vehicles this year, although police impact fees are actually paying a significant portion of that for this year so that we can get 2 back on the books. Other than that, no significant changes. There was a salary increase. We renegotiated the union contract this year. But that's set for the next 3 years. You will see if you went back and compared this line for line with last year's budget that there's going to be some increased costs for specific support for them that we are putting in this budget that we didn't prior. Some of that for the professional services, I think some of the computer stuff. We are trying hard to make sure that the cost is accounted for where you would see it. So if it's a police related cost, we will put it under police instead of in a central location. The only exception to that is central stores and central computers, which are mostly shared functions. Page 21, we'll get into fire. Again, you can see that they're spending a significant amount on the SCBA equipment. There is an $8,000 match for that $156,000 grant, but that's also being paid out of impact fees. Vehicle replacement, you'll see that. The nice part about that is that's already complete, correct? Yeah. If you haven't checked it out, they have a brand new pickup. By brand new, I mean used. But they decked it out pretty nice, and it's actually a really nice truck. So check it out if you get time. Wages and salary for the firefighters are still on the contract from last year, so no significant changes there. Although I will say that we have realized significant savings in overtime in the fire through changing, one, some accounting principles, but two, the union has been working with us exceptionally well to try and increase the usage of our reserves. We've actually gone to prior it was a shift was 3 firefighters. Reserves came in occasionally. We've actually now worked out an agreement where almost every day there's a 12-hour shift of a reserve. So there's 4 on shift, which gives them a little more capability. But they've also agreed that if someone's out on vacation or for callback, that we can use that reserve for the union work. So that has realized some savings and kind of smoothed out the whole process a little bit. And I have to say, Nate's doing a great job on some of the medical billing as well. We've seen some increases there as he's worked through what we can bill, how we can bill. So they've actually realized quite a few good improvements in the fire department in making that a little more efficient. So
in the overtime, in the 420, 401 section, kind of lose all these lines.
yeah, under the second one, the second
Then
section.
you have to scroll back up to see what I'm looking at. So what was budgeted in 18 was 64, and then for this next fiscal year, we're down to 20. And is that really what you're talking about as far as the big change in the work that obviously a lot of people put into lowering overtime and the problems that we have?
So the
Had-
answer to that is sort of.
Okay.
So you'll also notice right above that if you look at the 18 actuals, you'll see there's nothing under emergency callback, non-emergency callback, holiday callback. Previously, we've accounted for all that under overtime. It wasn't actual overtime, it was specialty pay. We've actually broken that out now into each specific item, we're tracking it differently so we can see where those costs are actually incurred as opposed to just lumping it all into overtime. So you'd actually have to add up those costs above there. However,
More.
it's more, but we were significantly under budgeting.
Yeah, exactly.
It never, I don't think we ever met our budget for overtime.
But have we been able to find any solutions to the problem that?
Well, yeah. part-
So while that is more than what was, so that was more than what was budgeted, it's actually less than what we've been spending. So we actually have seen a reduction in total overtime costs. Not so much in overtime, but especially in emergency callbacks and non-emergency callbacks, because non-emergency callbacks basically shift coverage. So since we're doing the 4 to maintain 3, and I would say as important, although it doesn't show up on the budget sheet as much, we've actually gotten guys to take their vacation a little more, which I think is going to serve us better in the long term from burnout. Guys were not getting much time off when they were running it all themselves. So they've actually been able to take some sick leave. They've actually been able to take some vacation time. And that was significant. Would you agree, Chief, that that's significant? Right. So that's a non-fiscal benefit to that change, but I think it's an important one. But yes, it is actually saving money as well. So it's a win-win. That being said, if you look at the reserve budget, it will be significantly higher than it was in the past because we're utilizing them more. It's fairly complicated to go through and try and figure out the one-for-one offset. We've spent a lot of hours on that. But again, there's another benefit there that isn't fiscal, and our reserves are probably going to be much more ready to fill in and move up into permanent positions than past reserves have. They're getting a lot more time. They're doing the training. They're hanging out with the crews. I think I like to call it the world's longest job interview. You really get to know them, and they really get to know the department as well. So that's a great addition to how we run the reserves. How many total reserves do we have now, Chief?
But it's still at 49,000 in the
Sure.
reserve amount and 7,500 with the operating. So still reasonable as far as what we're
It
getting
is.
out of it.
I think that's actually a pretty good deal. So overall, there's been a lot of improvements, I think, in the both fire budget, but fire operations as well. And I think one of the nice things is most of it has been union led, so they don't resist their own ideas. So it's great. Building inspector is the next budget. I don't think there's anything significant in that changes. There were some pay increases, and again, we have the new things accounted for that drive up some of the costs, but no significant changes in how that is budgeted or executed. Animal control is on page 23. Nothing new in animal control. The healthcare costs are accounted for. There's nothing significant that we changed in there, just standard cost increase. 24 is roaming crew. Again, roaming crew will probably, unfortunately, see a lot of cost savings in this cycle because we still haven't been able to hire our seasonals. What do we have? We still have one seasonal, Shannon. Yeah, we still have one out of the 5 initial planned, which makes, that's what's bled over into not being able to do street sweeping operations, right? Because we have no seasonals to help out with road stuff. So the road crew is plenty busy with the shape of the roads this year, plus the downtown project, plus the 5th to 8th sewer. There's enough projects going on that we couldn't spare anybody for that. So I would love to say that we can fix that with the budget. I don't know if the budget's going to be able to fix that. I'm not sure we can pay enough to attract people to seasonal jobs. It's just not tenable right now. So we are actually looking at some ways to contract some of it out. We're running kind of a mini test case with finance to see if we can contract out the mowing and landscaping there. And then we'll see where that goes from there. Cemetery, nothing much changes in the cemetery. Roaming operating costs is, you can see there that we saved $743 by disconnecting their phone. That's one of the savings
But no one
that no one
answered.
answered. Well, and they'll get IP phones now instead of just having a regular phone line. And then at the bottom is probably the most important part, at least as far as the community is concerned, the part that they'll see. This is a year for tennis court resurfacing. So if you're not familiar with that, we have a maintenance agreement with the Tennis Association. We are responsible for a portion of the resurfacing costs every year, as well as they kick in some and the schools, right? Is it schools? And the county, that's right. The schools, county, the association, and the city. So 12,000 is our portion for this year's resurfacing. We are looking at getting a wheelchair swing put into Sacagawea for 5,000, and then we are using some of the impact fees to pay for some of that, which is where we reduce that by 10,000. The rest of it, parks operating, you can see we control, no big changes there. I was going to look at our, there we go, tree maintenance. So in the second, just above the Civic Center admin, tree maintenance is item 402 there. You can see that we actually have budgeted $13,000 for this year. As we talked about in the meeting the other night, that's probably not enough. It certainly isn't enough if we're looking to do some of the things we want to do, as in variety of species, to get rid of some of the ash trees and replace them with different species, to replace some of the other trees under power lines. 13,000 pretty much keeps us, well, I won't even say it keeps us maintained, but it does let us do at least some of the maintenance we need to do through mainly the parks and some of the boulevard trees. Swimming pool and splash park. So in the, when we're talking roaming crew, that's the maintenance costs. The Civic Center was the operations costs. Chemicals, you can see is 11,000. There is a UV system that'll be put into the splash park. And there's also, is Rotary adding a feature this year, Shannon, or was that last year? Yeah, so the Rotary Club has purchased a feature to be added in there this year, so that's great. And again, we're spending 10,000 in impact fees there.
What's the UV system? That's just water treatment or something?
It's water treatment for the splash park itself. Since that water is mostly recirculated, it needs another form of treatment, and the UV will help make sure that that's sanitary. Yep. Page 25 is your non-departmental spending. So public work admin, nothing there. Claims paid, transfer to other funds. So you can see those are the two transfers right there. The dispatch support at 375,000, and we'll go over the full dispatch budget when we go through some of the other funds. But that's while the dispatch has its own fund, all the funding from the city comes out of the general fund. So that's the amount that's going out to dispatch for our portion. And then the transfer to the railroad fund, that's to cover that last year payment that we have been saving up for. That's another 8,000. So that's the end of the sections. And then we're back to the last page again. It gives you some of the totals there on the last page. State retirement share, you can see is new this year, or at least the way we're presenting it is new. And then we go back through all of the numbers that we've already gone over. And that is your proposed FY20 budget.
Commissioners, do you have any questions at this time? Any concerns or anything shocking? Nothing.
I'm shocked that he did that in under 45 minutes. Does that count?
Well, but this is so much more understandable than the stuff I saw when I first became commissioner. I mean, really, I've just, yeah.
We
Not
still
as
had it
colorful.
first
A
page.
normal person. I'm kind of normal, but can really understand it.
I'm waiting for the color.
You'll get all the charts and everything in the final budget proposal,
And
once we get all the
bigger.
other funds done.
Bigger print for Quentin.
No, I just remembered. Readers. Well, nice thing about the laptop, I can kind of blow it up.
So that's it?
That's so,
Like, we
I'll-
need to do something else that,
so it's a work session, so there's no decisions to be made tonight. But if there is something that you want us to change direction on, if there's something that needs to be changed, we can do that. If not, this will stand as the draft budget, and then we'll move on to the enterprise funds and the rest of the funds. We'll go do a similar work session on those. And then once you're comfortable with all of those, we'll combine them all into the budget presentation. And we'll try to get that done by the end of June. Can we get that all done by the end of June? We'll get it all done by the end of June.
Well, yeah, the way I look at it, the way it's finally presented and stuff like that, we shouldn't have as many questions. If we have that many questions, it's not done right, I swear, you know. I mean, I'd see Wind Rider funded in there again for another year. Just want to make sure that was in there.
Well, that's nice because the strategic plan tells us what you wanted to fund.
That was our priority.
And so we put it in there.
so when, that's what I would like to bring up is when people wondered how the commission or the community's wants were represented in budgets. Now you can see it through the plan as well as in little sections where the little notes on the side where you're noting it, which helps people to see this is where we're implementing some of our goals.
Yeah, it helped me a lot too. Yeah.
So, and I will pitch at this point, if you go to the website, we are updating the strategic plan every couple of weeks. So if there's, and highlighting it with color so you can see what's been done, what's changed, if something's complete, if something isn't going to get done, it's all out there. And we put a date on the front cover that says the last time it was updated so people can see.
Great. All right. That's it. Any public comment or questions?
Come on, Park County can say something.
Staff? Staff
Come on.
want to say anything?
Erica.
Oh,
Find ideas.
I like that.
Oh, we're going to show you the strategic plan. That's great. So scroll down. Oh, so there on the front is that you can see we actually updated it today. So that will get updated every time we put a new one out there. People can tell if there's a change since the last one. And then you can see complete. And if it's in blue, it means it's in progress, but we've actually done something. So that one, scroll up just a little bit there.
Is that official Livingston blue, I think?
I
that
think it
color
is.
called?
I don't know.
Mm.
So like there's a general fund. So as we're in the middle of it, our projected, our goal is 33.33%. Our projected for FY20 now is 22%. So people can see where we are. Incorporate budget grouping. So the budget groupings are kind of what you saw tonight, where we could have it by function, but also by, personnel. And
Yeah,
so that was kind of
and the real cost too, those, yeah.
gateway tax obviously failed. So that's there.
What if we get to a place where we're not getting that goal completed? Or near to even working on it, will you just keep the date in and then note it? Or how will that look?
I actually will. So scroll down a little further. Let's see if we can find where I put that in. It might be in infrastructure. So that tells you what everything is. There we go. So Centennial Lift Station. So this tells you how I'm looking at time changes. It may need to be advanced on the timeline due to development possibility. So if more development occurs, that one may get shoved up. If it was going to get delayed, I won't change any of the dates unless you want to when we do the annual update.
I don't
So-
mind if you slash it out and keep it there as our, like this is what
original?
We're trying for,
Sure.
and sometimes it's better and, or sooner,
Right.
and sometimes it's like.
So I'll note it through the year, and then at the end of the year, you can decide, do we want to change the date? Do we want to leave the date? Do we want to cross it out and put a new date? We'll have all those options at the end of the year. But I think we're,
Yeah, that's a good idea.
we're showing, I think if people realize it's out there, they can see where we are in the process of actually using the strategic plan on a daily basis. I actually update it about every 2 weeks because we do something. It helps keeps it focused,
And we're
so
looking at like $250,000 to upgrade that lift station.
probably, depends, but that's kind of a rough estimate right now.
Where's that located?
That's by Matt's Meats, right on 89 there, by the Travel Lodge. So that would be any
Takes care of everything on the other side of the
interstate.
interstate.
So let people know that's out there. It's a good tool if they want to see how we're using it and we've actually added it to the banner, so it's easier for people to find. If you just go down to the banner, it's right there.
Are you able to see on the back end how often people are using those things? Like how often people click on them?
I think we can. I don't remember how, but yes, we have that
Awesome.
ability. Yes.
Not that it's a high priority, but just curious.
No, but yeah, curious, yeah.
If it showed,
how many people
IP
are
addresses, it would show that I access it all the time. I'm running that count up every day. But it
Yeah,
works
the
really well.
numbers.
Thank you for updating it regularly.
Yeah.
Even if no one but you uses it every 2 weeks, although I'm sure other people do. Thank you for updating it.
One question. This might be too specific, but we hit that vandalism at the pool. You talked to get security cameras for all the public buildings. Is that gonna be in that budget or this year's budget?
It's probably not going to make it until the FY21 budget, if I had to guess. It's still on there. It's on our list. It's actually a pretty high priority, but we haven't figured out yet. One, we want to make sure the WRF is done so that we can include that in the package because we'd like to do it as a network instead of standalone cameras. And so we want to make sure the construction is finished first, and then we'll get a bid for what it will take to put on all the buildings at one time and try and upgrade it.
Anything else? Do we have a motion for adjournment?
I'll second.
We have a motion by Maybe and a second by Schwartz. Roll call, please. Yes?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
This meeting of the Livingston City Commission budget meeting, I should say, is adjourned at 6:55 PM.
As soon as I open my mouth, I'm gonna be bad.